There we go. This session is now being recorded. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Today we have Annette Liskey that's going to be talking about building complex web forms with RuleBox and TestBox. Annette, welcome. I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you run this. If you need me, I am here listening rapidly to your presentation. Go for it.
Hi, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Adobe. Thanks to all of the participants who are here today. I'm happy to share with you this solution that I've designed for handling a complex web form using a couple of Ortis's modules called RuleBox and TestBox. This presentation is going to start by teaching you how you can derive the conditional logic from your web form and put it into a format where it's rules in a rules engine like RuleBox. And then we'll look at using TestBox to write some automated tests that you can use to validate those rules. And finally, I'll wrap it around with the Cold Fusion code that you would use and the algorithm that you would use to put this into practice. General outline, I'm going to tell you what the project was that sparked this idea for me. We'll look at the concept of a rules engine in general, and then we're going to do a simple proof of concept demo to put this into place. And then I'll do a more complex demo, and I'll give you some lessons learned from the project that I applied this solution to. My role at UVA is in the VP of Research department. So we're dealing with a lot of compliance, health and safety regulations that are at the institutional level, the grant level, and all the way up to the federal level. And I'm sort of embedded in this human subject research department. So I'm part business advisor, part project manager. I'm the developer from the database to the JavaScript and everything in between. We are a small shop. There's, I'll say, 2.5 developers because my manager still dabbles in development. We have, we've always used Cold Fusion. Even before I joined the team about 6 or 7 years ago, the products were developed in Cold Fusion since 20 years ago. We've tried other frameworks. More recently, we've been using the ColdBox framework. And I'll say not all of our projects are using ColdBox, but we have chosen to use it as our solution of choice for new projects. And that's why this presentation is so heavily reliant upon their tools, is because we've already made that decision for this project that we're all in with ColdBox. The project that sparked this all. So we have an annual requirement that all teams doing human subject research have to complete a continuation form to make sure it goes to the board. The board makes sure that the work they're doing is still effective and ethical and complies with all necessary regulations. This form can be as short as one question. If the first question is, what's your study status? And your study status is closed, you're done. Form's done. But depending on the complexity of your research, there could be up to 80 possible questions that you're answering here, with all sorts of nested conditions about answer question A if B and C are true, and things like that. So you can imagine this is a PDF created by people who don't usually create PDFs. It was quite a burden. And literally everybody who touched this project, from the researchers that would complete the form, the staff that had to review it, the board that had to sign off on it, everybody hated this PDF. So I was tasked with breaking down this PDF into its individual questions, the logic behind them, and turn it into a web form. Some of the logic that's behind this is, there's questions that are always required. Like I said, there's questions that are required under certain conditions. And those conditions could be previous answers within the form, or they could be external data points in one of our other databases. And sometimes, depending on your answer to your question, You may even trigger some mandatory or optional follow-up items. And then just to make it even more fun, we have up to 3 versions of this form that are basically the first 2 are subsets of the final one, which is the massive one. And we need to be able to make changes to the forms for future completion without altering the forms that have previously been completed. So that is, for example, if we change the text in a language, the text of the question's language, then we need to be sure that we have a known cut date when everybody who's answered it previously has their given definitions and everybody who answers it going forward has their own. So that's just to say versioning within these forms was very important. Enter RuleBox and TestBox from Ortis. So I saw Luis, the CEO of Ortis, do a presentation on RuleBox at CF Summit in Vegas a couple years ago. And he was showing how you could, I think the demo was the coming up with the rate for a mortgage and how you could send this function list of facts. Your function knows the rules for those facts and it returns to you the object. And I immediately thought of all of our crazy WebLogic forms and how I would apply that. So I filed it away for later, and a couple years later, here I am using this in a project. So let's talk about what is a rules engine. If you have this continuum between imperative programming on one side and AI machine learning on the other side, the rules engine sits somewhere in the middle, a little bit closer to the imperative programming side. So you are still writing out your rules, but you're writing it in a sort of a business language feel, not so much a programming feel, and you're writing it in a way that's reusable and repeatable. So you don't have imperative programming dealing with every specific question and every specific offset of that question. You've abstracted it. And that's going to make your work more sustainable in the long term because inevitably these things change and developers change too. So the more that you can make it flexible enough to deal with that change that you're anticipating, the more useful your work is going to be in the long term. So, an interesting source that I found when I was looking for references here was a Capital One tech blog. I can't vouch for the state of it in any other context, but this blog post was very useful for sort of comparing and contrasting and helping you make a decision about which one of these options is going to be the best solution for your project. As a point of contrast, a rules engine is not something like Drools, where it's really specifically a business rules management system. It's a little, I'll say, like simpler as well as more flexible than that. It's not. It's not Qualtrics, right? It's not this question builder drop down menus UI where you can map out the flow of your web form. It's not a truth table, it's not a decision table. It's nothing that you would code up in that manner. But a decision table is really useful for documenting the logic and serving as a draft when it comes to write your test. You need to know what cases to cover. So that part could be useful, and you'll see an example of that when I get to the test box section of this presentation. You would want to use a rules engine if you want to get away from code that looks like this. Switches, if else's that go down 12 levels deep. That is not readable. I mean, I've been programming for 20 years, and even something like this still makes my brain hurt. I find it frustrating to have to manage all that logic in my head while thinking about the different variables that might traverse this logic. So I'm looking for something that is going to be more sustainable in the long term, more readable, but You still have to know the logic. You have to know the logic in and out in order to write rules for and against it. RuleBox in particular, as a rules engine, is based on another project called Rulebook. They are almost identical, just different languages. The idea is that you send a set of facts into this rules engine, and what you get is a result after all of the rules have been acted upon. You get to write your rules in that nice given when then format that's familiar to people who've been doing automated testing. And like I said, pairs really nicely with TestBox. In fact, the language that you use to write tests in TestBox can also use given when then. Given when then in the sphere of RuleBox means that the given is a struct of facts. It's called facts within the code too. There's a when method. That's basically a closure that evaluates to true. If it evaluates to true, the then action is executed. If the closure in the when statement evaluates to false, that rule is skipped or not executed and it moves on to the next one in the list. Here's our proof of concept. Hopefully this will start to become something more concrete in your minds as we go through this. So I want you to think of the simple color wheel. Primary colors, red, blue, orange. You mix two colors together, your result is a new color. Remember, right now we're just trying to understand the concept of a rules engine and how to write rules. We'll get to the part where we do this with web forms a little bit later. In this case, our given is two colors that we're mixing together. We have an example of a when. If one color is red, the other is blue. The result is violet. This is what it looks like when you write a rule to match that condition. Okay, we have these sort of wraparound things. Documentation explains them. What we're looking at is the name. That's a human-friendly name. You'll see where it comes up in a little bit. Here's our when. When is a closure. If you're not familiar with closures, just imagine a simple function that runs independently and then returns its result. It doesn't have to be separated. It just simply goes between these parentheses, curly brackets. That's your function. That's your closure, I should say. So within the closure, I have a conditional statement here that says if color 1 is red or blue and color 2 is red or blue, if that statement evaluates to true, the actions in then are going to occur. What we've done here is we've set the value of the results object that's going to be returned by the rules. Little exception here. So I need to make this smart enough to handle what happens if color 1 and color 2 are the same. And I've done that by adding the except method here. So this negates the when. If when is true and except is also true, we are not executing the actions in the then method. I will also mention stop here. So stop tells the rules engine, we're done, return the result. Without the stop method, if this evaluated to true, the actions within the then method are still going to occur, are valuably set to violet, but the rules will continue executing in sequential order. So that results object could be further modified down the road. And the documentation for rule books has a good example of this in the calculation of I think the mortgage interest score or something like that, where it sets a base score and then it continues running rules that may decrease, apply a discount to the mortgage rate. So I think that's an interesting application. In my situation, any rule that executed was the final was the final answer for results. So I didn't have to apply that. All of my rules end with stop in my project. This is how you put more than one rule together. So you write a component, the component extends the rulebook model. All of your rules are going to go inside the define rules method. There's some syntax. Check the documentation. You want to make sure your parentheses and curly brackets all match up nicely so you don't get any errors with execution. Remember when you're writing your rules. So a rule is skipped if the when clause evaluates default. If when is true, the actions in the then method execute and affect the result. If when is true and stop is written into that rule, no further rules are checked. The results object is returned. This is what it looks like when you put lots of color rules together. You can see I've collapsed, for brevity's sake, but essentially they're all the same. Each one has a stop method. So if any of these evaluates to true and the then method actions occur, the result is returned. And you can see a little bit more with, the syntax for structuring and daisy chaining these rules. If you wanted to take this a step further in our simple concept here, let's say we're now dealing with secondary colors and intermediate colors. So we need to handle cases where the fact struct has color 3, and color 4. Well, they're all still going to go inside that same define rules function. But I'm going to be strategic about where I place my rules. I want the more specific rules to come first. That the reason being, if I send red, blue, and yellow into the system, and I have a simple rule first that only looks for red and blue, I'm going to return an inaccurate result because yellow was present, but yellow was not checked by the first rule that executed. So that's why you need to put your more specific cases first. And be deliberate when you use that stop method as well. Maybe your web form, maybe your project is a case where the rules are really separate. In that case, you may want to create different rules files and then call one or the other depending on cases, conditions that are decided before you get to the rules call. And so maybe my function that calls these rules, I say, if 3 colors are known, call the rule fact sheet for the 3 color conditions. If only 2 colors are known, call the rules for the 2 color conditions. How do you call the rules? This is the structure of a typical cold box site. Your rules file is going to go in the models folder. If you're not using modules in your application, you just use this top level models folder. Modules, this one, that's where the cold box specific modules go. And modules app is where you put the modules that are for your project, your application. Module is simply, a plug and play chunk of code. A little bit more to that, but it's a way to kind of gather all of your little MVC components for that piece of the project or that particular function, utility, put that all together. I like to do a utilities module. So I'm putting my rules inside the models folder of my utilities module. And then I have the code, which is going to call the rules function over here in another module called color. And I've written it up as color service. Within my color service file, it's a component, and I am using RuleBox, another cold box utility, to inject the rules into the color service component. This RuleBox is a dependency injection tool. If you're not familiar with it, think of it as a include statement. So I have this new property called rules that I can reference anywhere in this component's code. And whenever I say rules, Cold Fusion or ColdBox is going to go out and grab the color rules file from the models folder of the utilities module. And this is how it's mapped out in Wirebox. By default, ColdBox just maps out everything in any of your models folders across the whole app, whether they're in modules or not. Within this color service, I have a function, mix two colors. Inside that function, what I'm doing is I'm going to define my facts struct. I'm going to send those facts to the rules engine, and I'm going to get a result. Here's where I'm assigning the variables within my struct. This is where the results is receiving what's returned from rules. That is the rules file I injected with Wirebox. Given all of the facts in this struct as I've written it, run the rules. And that's it. When RuleBox gets into action, it sees there's facts.color1, facts.color2, looks at the value of those facts, and it returns to me the answer of violet or orange, depending on what those colors are. There's other ways you can structure this. Like you can define your struct within this given all statement. There's a couple other ways you can do it. I've even seen where you can send the facts an entire component with methods and everything. That's in the documentation that Ortis has put out for RuleBox. The result that you get, it's a object or a component. It has properties and methods. Here's our value of blue, and that's the value that was returned by the rules. There is an optional default value you can include as well. Other properties are this nice rules status map that you'll be able to use for auditing which rules did and did not fire. And it's also reminding you of the facts that you sent to your rule, which is handy if you're doing this in the middle of a loop and you're not sure exactly which answer in that group of 15 was the one that did it. We're going to take another look at this rule status map. This is how you audit your rules. It's going to tell you what did and did not happen. Skipped means that the when did not evaluate to true. That rule did not execute, its then method did nothing. Executed means that the when method evaluated to true, and then the actions occurred. If it stopped, then the actions occurred and the rules ceased to fire any further because of the stop method that was applied to that particular rule. And the way you get this is you're just going to right dump the results objects get rule status map method. Let's look at testing the rules. And we'll still use our simple example with the color wheel. Some things you might want to know. Is there a result? Did the rules fire at all? Is it the right format? Is it the right value? Make sure you include one thing that's expected to be false as well, because your rule could just be applying itself to everything. If it's written wrong, I mean. This is an example of a test case matrix. And this is sort of what I think of when I think of the decision table sort of thing that might go into a different approach to rules management. And basically, I've written my cases as the headers in the rows and the columns. And then I've written the results of those cases within the body of the table. And this is telling me when I write the rules, I'm going to write a rule for each significant case that has to be checked there. Tests go in the tests folder in your ColdBox setup. Now remember this module's up here. That's where TestBox is going to be. The code for TestBox is there, but the default setup for A ColdBox app also has this tests folder, and that's where TestBox is looking for the code that's going to run these tests for us. This is what a test looks like. We're mapping in the rules file, the component, as something called the rules. That's also using Wirebox again. We are using the give and all method to send it a struct of facts, and we are telling the rules to run. And then we're writing our expectations. Right now, we expect the result to be present, and we expect that to be true, that the result is present. You can go to your browser, run the test. There's other ways to run the test. This is an example of how it looks in the browser. We get some nice green check boxes to say that our rules have passed. We can daisy chain these rules, same way we daisy chained rules in RuleBox. Sorry, I should say we can daisy chain these tests the same way that we daisy chains rules in RuleBox. Each test has an expectation. Each test has basically the same code in between. Our expectation's different. So first, we just expect the result to be there. Second, we're saying expect this to be a string. Expect the value to be violet. Expect the value not to be orange. There's all kinds of expectations that are available within TestBox. Again, I'm going to refer you to the docs if you want to see what all your options are. What that looks like in a browser is this nice output here where we have the names of our rules, our tests, sorry, the names of our tests, the name of the group that we're testing within, and then yay or nay, did that test pass? We can structure it differently, of course. You can put multiple expectations on any given rule. You don't have to duplicate all of that code. Just put multiple expectations on a single rule. Your output's going to look a bit different. Just in terms of what you see in a browser. So think about how you want to group your tests. Do you want to test for a particular question group? Maybe just the first 3 questions because that's name, address, birthday. And when you're running your tests, you want to be able to test those independently and test them as a entire set, yay or nay. Maybe you want to get more granular. Maybe you need more specificity. So let's look at a more complex example. This is the application for free lunch. This is not my project. This is simply another sort of proof of concept of how you would apply this to a real world scenario. Here's the PDF. If you do the Google free application for federal student aid for school meals, this is what you get for the PDF. And this is the PDF that's distributed to schools all over the nation. They can all use this template. What's interesting is this one as a proof of concept is the federal government also sponsored a redesign of this and they now have a prototype, a web app prototype that can be used by school districts across the nation as well. And they have a project page where they talk about what they did and why and how you use this on your own school district servers. And it's a really interesting test case for moving from a PDF to a web form. What we're mostly going to look at in our concept here is step 2 here, where it's saying, do any household members receive assistance? If no, go to step 3. If yes, answer this question right here. And that's the classic case of conditional logic within a web form. Your question flow is being dictated by a prior answer. So if the prior answer here is no, this question never even has to appear to the user completing the form. If it's yes, however, this question becomes required. How I would approach this project from a general object mapping database design perspective is that there is a form template. And that form template contains all of the possible questions, every single possible question that can be asked within this form. Then I have a form entity, and the form entity is the record for the form being completed by an individual person or user. This form has answers. Of course, the answers are related to the questions. And this form also has a table called questions shown or required questions. And that's where we are saying for each possible question in the form template, do we or do we not need to show that question to the user? Very simple schematics here to help you with your mental model of this project. So our general algorithm, how we're going to do this, we create a new form entity for each user. Upon creation of that form entity, we are copying over or making available or something like that, associating the potential questions for that form template to this individual user's form entity. Each of those possible questions has a property that denotes whether or not it's shown always. Maybe it's a mandatory question for everyone, and whether it's shown for this particular form entity. So whether it's is required bit is going to be applied to any particular form entity. And as you go through and save each answer in your form, you're going to call the rules and you're going to get the rules to tell you what resulting questions should or should not be required based on the user's answer to the previous question. Clear as mud, right? It gets a bit better when we get into more specifics. So that show question Boolean that I've been speaking of, the one that defines whether the question is shown for any given form entity, you may have it be always required. You may have it be conditionally required, but you only have to look at it if it is a dependent question. So let me jump ahead a little bit. Conditional questions are ones that are shown or not shown depending on the answers to other questions, or external data points, which can just be treated as answers to questions. You want to look for the conditional factors. That is, the other answers or data that are influencing whether that conditional question is shown or not. You may want to create a related questions table that's keeping track of this for you. There's another approach. Option 2 would be to use question groups. And this works well if your form and the logic behind its form is segmented into discrete parts, usually ones that match a real world context. So you may, for example, ask for demographic information, and those demographic information questions are only affected by other elements within that section of the form. And if that works, if that's your scenario, then question groups is probably the way to go. You're going to match multiple questions into a single question group. What you're doing with these conditional questions and question group tables is anytime you're looking for which questions need to be evaluated upon the save of an answer to a previous question. So in our PDF example, I'm going to go back really quickly. This is the conditional question. And so upon save of answer for number 2, we need a way for the system to identify all of the questions that can be required or not required based on the value of answer number 2. And we also need a way to programmatically identify what those questions are. So that's where your dependent questions or question groups come into play. You're defining the interdependencies between answers and requirements to show questions. Going back to where we were. evaluate it based on your form, its structure, and its conditional logic. The main point is you don't want to call the rules on every save and have it evaluate every other question in your web form. You're trying to find a way to make this more efficient so it's only running on the rules that matter. I should say on the questions that matter. So where we're using RuleBox in this is upon save of a question, we need to tell RuleBox what is the question we want to check. That is, what is the dependent question here? And what is the answer or other facts that we know that are going to influence whether that question to check is required or not. And the results that you're getting is a simple true or false. True if the question to check has become required. False if the question to check has become not required based on the facts we've sent to rules. This is what it might look like if we used RuleBox for our free lunch application. So when the question to check is the case number, that is our follow-up question, and the known fact is that somebody clicked yes on that does your family need assistance, that does your family receive assistance question. If that's true, then we're returning the value of true to say that question to check case number is required, or conversely not required. This is the function that we call the rules. I've created a nice check case number function here. I send it the answer to that web form, the answer received from that web form, and I call the rules with the question to check and the value of is assistance in the fact structure. However, this is imperative programming. Right. I have a function specifically for that one question. I have hard coded in here what rules I'm sending, what facts I'm sending to the rules. This isn't really getting us very further on that spectrum between imperative programming and RuleBox before we get to, the ultimate solution of AI and machine learning that we're inevitably coming to as a human race. That's where you're going to use this algorithm that I came up with. And this is where we apply the knowledge that you, the program, have extracted from the PDF or web form and documented in terms of question groups or dependent question tables within your application. So first we're looking, we're excluding any cases where the answer saved does not affect anything. Skip all of those cases entirely. We're not going to run the rules on those. We will get all of the questions that are in the same group as the question we've received the answer to. And that's if you're using question groups to manage these things. If you're doing it with more discrete options using conditional questions, it's still going to be a similar thing. So you go through your question group. It's an array. Every question that's in that group, see if there's an answer to it. If there's an answer to it already recorded, get that answer, pull it out, put it in the fact struct. This is what it looks like in code. I have a nice abstract save answer function. I've sent it this particular this particular report/form. I guess I renamed my variable somewhere along the line. The question that has been answered and the value of that answer. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if the answer I've received is for a question that affects anything. And if it does affect things, I'm going to call my update report requirements function and tell it what I need, what question group I need it to run its rules on. The second part is simply, I'm also using ColdBox ORM, and that's how you would use the ORM virtual entity service to check to see if this answer is in my table about dependent questions, related questions, etc. When I get to that set report requirements function, here's where I'm getting all the questions in that question group. And I'm going to loop through these questions twice. The first time I loop through these questions, I'm getting the answer for that question if it is known. If it is known, I add the questions slug, that is my human readable label for it, and the questions answer value to the struct. If it's not known, I'm just simply sending in an empty string in place of the answer. I am appending each individual answer struct to a larger struct called the facts. And then what I'm going to do in the second part of the algorithm is I am going to loop through all of the questions in the question group again. And if it is a conditional question, that is one that's not always required, mandatory for everyone, I need to evaluate that question. I need to know, is this question now required or not required based on the new facts that I've received, the new answer to the triggering question. So I'm looping through the questions in my question group again. And if it's not an external data question and it's not an always mandatory question, we're going to call the rules on it. When we call the rules, we are saying the question to check is this particular question, the one we're currently at in our loop. And we are sending it the fact struct that we previously compiled when we gathered the answers to all the questions in this question group. And the result we are returned with is a true or false that says whether this particular question is required. And I send that over to another function that updates the record. So what we've been able to achieve by using this approach is that we have moved all the specificity into a rules file, where those specific things are written in a given when then format that's also been reproduced in the tests. And so we have the flexibility to add new rules as needed, but we don't have to alter the algorithm that is calling the rules to determine if any given question is required or not required. So if you have a new question, you write some new rules for it. That's all you have to change. If the conditions behind one of your questions alters, maybe the income level has changed with the new tax year, alter your rules. Don't alter the code that calls the rules. And so we've been able to isolate the business logic from the rest of our application's code that manages things like logins and everything else that my mind just went to in terms of what it takes to get something like this off the ground. I like that it can also, RuleBox is flexible enough that we're not just talking, we're really not just talking yes, no. Like I said in the example, there's the documentation have that mortgage interest example. Another way we could use RuleBox within our current example of the lunch application is maybe we can give people an answer right away. We have all the input. We have this table here that tells us what their income level has to be to qualify. We can run all of our rules, all of our facts into a rules engine that evaluates whether or not this particular applicant meets the guidelines. Lessons I've learned from doing this project. Prototype, 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 especially if you're coming from a PDF or a paper-based form and you're moving it into a web application. That's a significant adjustment in terms of people's expectations about what is and is not possible. And it gives you a lot of opportunity to improve the user experience as well for everyone who's involved. If you have a prototype, you have a shared mental model. You have something everybody can point to and say, I thought it was going to be look like this, or we said the words were going to be this, or this question was meant to be true or false. Get those conversations out of the way before you start coding. Because, like I said, people's expectations are going to change when it goes from a paper form to a web form. This is straight from the project page on the free application for federal for student lunch. This is what it looked like on the PDF. Does anybody participate in this? You know, it's the same question format. It's a yes, no. This is if we took the PDF and literally changed it into a web application without taking time to evaluate what's now possible. It's still a simple yes or no. This is another way you can do it. You can have checkboxes for each individual type of assistance, and you can show or hide, make required or not required, the case number based on whether this box has been checked. That is going to be helpful as well because now you don't have the user wondering, shoot, do I put in all my case numbers in one box? And you don't have the person evaluating the form saying, oh, is this a number for SNAP or is this a number for TAMP? So you've added some value by taking the time to reevaluate the form as what it can potentially become as a web application. I would say when you're doing your prototype, just lo-fi it, right? There's UX prototyping tools out there. Designers probably love them. If you're on a team large enough to have a designer, bless you. But for me, I just need wireframes. Even PowerPoint will do. I did end up using XD for this, and it was just enough without having too high of a barrier to entry. I would say make your conditional logic obvious in the prototype. Just go ahead and put your conditions right there on the screen where the where you're saying, here's the question, and you're only going to see the question in these circumstances. Does everybody agree? Yes or no? Because what's in this red box will turn into your rules. So the more that you can do to get everybody to agree on it first, make sure it's accurate, get the business stakeholders buy-in on this, and then when you sit down to actually write the rules, A, you'll have a place to refer to it, and B, you you know, if changes come, they are changes and not mistakes in your original discovery process. Throughout this, in my coding examples, you saw me use question slugs. So a question slug is my sort of human readable name for any given question. It's not the primary key in the database because it's going to be repeated. I use the same question slug across multiple question templates. So I have one form template that has 12 questions, and I have another form template that has 24 questions, those 12 plus a new 12. Well, my rules are the same for the first 12 questions in either form. So by using question slugs to write my rules, I'm able to be flexible enough to reuse those rules for multiple question templates. Also, I don't have to remember keys when I'm writing these rules. I don't have to say, um, if primary key is 45, then the answer for primary key number 57 must be this. Not going to happen. I was just thinking about how, we don't with our local dev and test environments, those primary keys might change as well. So, there's no way we would be able to collaboratively code if we weren't using something other than the database's assigned primary key to identify our questions and write rules to apply to those questions across all the development environments. So form templates are, if you recall our crude database diagram, the form template is the parent object, and then all potential questions are defined underneath of that. It's a one-to-many relationship. So if you have a new template, if you have a change to a question, you're probably going to require a new form template. At least in my world where regulatory language is very specific. Maybe things are more flexible in your scenario. So my rule of thumb is if it's a minor question change, I'm just going to use the same question slug. Same rules, same tests, same slugs. But if it's something more substantial, I need to actually, write a new set of rules that's going to, if the rules have changed, then I need to create a new slug for that new question so that I can apply the new rules to it. Here's some links to the things that I've referenced here. You've got RuleBox, you've got TestBox. Both of those are under Ortis's various GitHub accounts. The code for the color application that we looked at, that's on my GitHub, which is down here at the bottom. There's the link for the Capital One Tech blog that I talked about, and then the project page for that government project where they took the lunch app online. I find that really interesting, gives you an idea about what's possible. The other thing I talked about was Wirebox. That's built into the ColdBox framework. I also mentioned CBORM. It's just an object relational mapping module that ColdBox puts out. Quick would be another example, or straight ColdBox ORM. So I think that covers references for everything that I specified. The code for the algorithm, that's also up here in my GitHub repo. So take a look, reach out if you have any questions. I hope that this presentation has been useful for you in terms of thinking how you can get away from imperative programming and use RuleBox to create a flexible, readable, sustainable approach for managing the question flow and the conditional logic in your web forms. And I'll put in my UVA email address in here. Oops. That's the best way to reach me for professional correspondence. You're welcome. Does anybody have any questions?
I did not see any questions come up through the chat, and there are no questions in the Q&A. Come on, folks, there's got to be questions. Bill's typing. While folks are typing, Annette, so we are giving away a $50 gift certificate to folks, and you get to choose who that person is. You can choose how you want to do it. I think previous speakers have asked a question and had people just kind of post it into the chat. We had someone run a random number generator on the total number of people. Whatever you want to do.
Let's do a trivia.
Trivia. There we go. Yeah, let's do a trivia. So before you do that, Bill Brusman says, "Will this make UVA law school obsolete?" Go with no.
Not likely. If only we lived in a world where that was possible.
There you go. Okay, so everyone warm up your fingers, get ready to type into the lobby chat. Annette is going to ask you a trivia question, and the first fully correct answer that ends up in the lobby chat wins a $50 Amazon gift card. All right, Annette, hit it.
Okay, so in this presentation, I mentioned several ColdBox products that are either embedded in the ColdBox framework or added as optional modules. These are all box products. That's your clue. The first person who can tell me 3 of those box products gets the gift card.
Ooh.
Oh, I wouldn't count ColdBox. That's the whole framework. I'm looking for something inside the framework. Wirebox, TestBox, RuleBox is the first one.
So that's Jonathan?
That's Jonathan.
Okay, we have a winner. It is Jonathan. Jonathan, please give Apurva your email. You are the winner of the $50 Amazon gift card. Awesome. Thank you. We do have a couple of Q&A questions for
Okay.
you. The first one is from David Vigna. David asks, "How easy is it? Oh, wait a minute. How easy it to our nest cases? How easy?"
Oh, so my interpretation of that question is you're asking, um, how do you how do you use RuleBox to evaluate something if your yes or no answer depends on multiple previous ones? That's what I would think of as nested cases where you have if if the food is a fruit, then, if it's also an apple, peel it. If it's a banana, peel it, things like that. That's what I think of as nested cases. Uh, I think it's very flexible to do it. That's where you're gonna have specificity of rules. Like in my example about the color wheel, you have, rules for 2 colors, rules for 3 colors. And you may want your result to be set by the first one and potentially altered by the later ones. Your other approach might be to include everything higher up the hierarchy into that group of facts that you're sending. So think about how you're managing your question group or your dependent questions table to say what facts need to be included when you evaluate a given question. So rely on the stop method, rely on the structure of your data in the database for question groups or conditional questions, and also be aware that specificity and rules matter in the execution of the rules. Specificity
Awesome.
and order matters.
I'm so excited. By the way, this talk just solved a massive amount of problems for a former uh, customer of mine. They are doing all of this manually in an awful, awful miasma of ifs, elses, switches, just terrible, terrible mazes of awful spaghetti code. And
Mhm.
this would be just an absolute game changer. They were actually trying to do this with a front end form thing, and it just didn't work. It didn't work because they're all CF based. They were having to do all of this like transitioning of rules across, from the server to the front end, and this actually just does all of that in a much more simpler way in the Cold Fusion, ecosystem that they're comfortable with.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that, Mark. That's one of the things that motivated me to turn this into a presentation. I couldn't tell you how many web forms I've dealt with in my career, and I was so pleased to come up with this solution that abstracted a lot of that logic and made it reproducible.
Yeah, and I actually, so it looked like you do a lot of work with financial aid. Is that correct?
So we're in research compliance.
Ah,
But the second example application that I showed, that's not my project. That's a project that the federal government did for the application for free or reduced price student loan. My
gotcha,
project is
gotcha.
research compliance related.
Let's see. Terry asks, how does Rulebox compare with CF in terms of performance? Hmm.
That's a good question. I will admit I have not ran performance tests, mostly because I don't want to write all the CF ifs that I would need to manage something of the complexity that I'm dealing with. Where performance could be lacking, your trade off, if it is lacking, I don't know, but your trade off would be um, the ease of reading these rules, the ease of communicating with your stakeholders about these rules when they're getting written in this way, the sustainability of your code when you have to alter it or another developer inherits it, or you look at it again a year later and wonder who wrote this. The benefits that Rulebox brings to me are are going to be worth any performance trade-off that I can't imagine would be significant.
Yeah, I would also say, Terry, if you're really kind of concerned about getting some metrics, Brad Wood, I'm sure, would be delighted to sit down with you and go over every single level of metrics involved in performance. So yeah, and Scott has a good point there. Fusion Reactor, if you've got Fusion Reactor running, you could very easily run your old code against, a RuleBox, Wirebox based system and see what the actual performance. I would actually also add the PMT. If you don't want to pay for Fusion Reactor, PMT should very easily be able to give you those basic metrics on, page load times, function times, things like that. And it's included with every copy of Cold Fusion, and it's pretty good.
So I saw a question from Scott about did I show my tests? I showed the tests for the simple color wheel, and I showed how you can have a test written with multiple expectations, and this is what it would look like if you wrote your tests separately. That you can also find this in the GitHub repo for this presentation. And I'll paste my GitHub in here.
That is lovely. I love to see tests. TDD all day.
What's nice about having the tests written and automated is when you inevitably have to add a new question or a new logic, you're going to know that you have not altered anything that was previously working. And that's something you don't always get if you've got a bunch of if else's. You've got to track down where your logic went wrong. In this case, it'll tell you exactly what line went, and you can go find the suspicious rule and fix it.
Very nice. Yeah, I've gone down that rabbit hole many times in older code that's just a mishmash of if else then, all sorts of crazy things, and inevitably there's a hallway you miss, and a user will find it because that's how life goes, right?
That is true. You can cover all the scenarios except for the ones that your users think of.
Yeah, they're so good. They're so good at finding stuff.